morning, everyone. This is practical applications of the Dickerson Pyramid. My name is Nat Welch. I'm ICO on GitHub and Twitter, and I'm a lead site reliability engineer at First Look Media in New York. This talk's history of sort of me applying the Dickerson hierarchy through a bunch of different jobs. Some of them that I'll be talking about is a company called iFixit, which I worked at many years ago in San Luis Obispo, California as a software developer. Punched, which was a very small startup in San Francisco. Google, which you've probably heard of, as a software engineer on Google Offers and a site reliability engineer on two Google Cloud products, Google Cloud Storage and Google Compute Engine. And then my most recent past job, I was a site reliability engineer for all of 2016 at Hillary for America in Brooklyn, New York. A quick aside is context. Site reliability engineering means a lot of things to a lot of people, or a small number of people maybe. I learned SRE at Google, and so all of my views are heavily tinted by working for a large web company. I'm hoping that you can take some of these practical applications and apply it to whatever sort of software type job you do. If you have questions about how to maybe apply this to something else that's unusual, please talk to me afterwards. So, point of the talk, what is this Dickerson Pyramid thing? This is how it was originally published in a summary of Nori Heiken's, sorry if I mispronounced that, talk from QCon New York 2015. It's originally by Mikey Dickerson, who was an engineer at Google and then also at the United States Digital Service. He worked with Nori plus many others on the healthcare.gov thing and came up with this hierarchy pyramid as a way to explain sort of the things you need to make a service reliable. I've redrawn it in green and put a little circle around it because, you know, it's my talk. And the circle is supposed to mention communication, which I think is sort of the main thing that's missing from the pyramid. SRE as a role, as I've experienced it, requires talking to a lot of people. While as a software developer, I could maybe spend 70% of my time coding and 30% of my time talking to people. I find SRE is a much higher ratio, you know, 50-50 or higher, depending on the service and company. So I'm hoping to show how communication applies to all of these along with the practical applications I'll be mentioning. So the bottom level, as you saw, was monitoring. Often those little graphs that spike sometimes for better or for worse. This is a list of software that I've used at a bunch of different companies. The point here is that you can use whatever tool works for you. iFixit, we use like Cactus and Ganglia and it worked. Punched, we just used Pingdom because like really all we cared about was if the software was up and our customers could get to it. Google has a large internal system called Borgmon for monitoring. Hillary for America, we used a large installation of Datadog, or hosted version of Datadog. First Look Media, right now, we use Pingdom and CloudWatch. How does communication fit into monitoring? Monitoring is the thing that you use to find out if things are up or working or doing the thing you expect. But every business is different, and what you actually want to watch and pay attention to is very different. And so you need to talk to the people you work with and what monitoring tools fits your business needs, and what metrics does your business care about, and also what metrics do you care about to actually do your job as either a software engineer or SRE or ops person or whatever, and making sure that not just your job, but all of the roles that you have to support can actually get to those metrics and that they're being recorded. My first practical application of monitoring comes from my current job, First Look Media. We're a growing media company. We only currently have 10 or 11 engineers, but we support a bunch of different websites. And right now, our current metrics, things are up most of the time, but we're starting to realize that we're having outages that we're not noticing. August, we had 3 outages where better monitoring would have improved downtime. we had about 10 to 15 minutes of degraded service for each outage that if we had monitoring, or better monitoring, we probably would have discovered those outages earlier. So right now we're working through plans, and the big thing is cost evaluation. We don't have a lot of money because we're relatively young, and so figuring out what the tools we need versus how much money we're willing to spend, and what solves the business problems. And these are large conversations that are ongoing. But the bigger thing is also figuring out how to change our engineering culture so that people actually are, think to look at the metrics instead of just like, well, we could add a cache layer or we could just scale it. And oftentimes there's no data to support that, but we're still figuring all of that out. And so it's a culture shift along with sort of starting to ask the right questions. Picture of our hierarchy again, monitoring at the bottom. Now that we have monitoring, we can talk about incident response, because as soon as you have monitoring, you're going to start noticing that things are not working as you expect. The sort of two categories I think of when I think of incident response are alerting, along the lines of who gets alerted and when do you get alerted, and how quickly does that person need to respond. And incident communication, where is communication done and who is in charge? There's a long topic that someone else could probably cover on NIMS, which is how most US incident response groups deal with delegation when you come to a large fire or national emergency or things like that. It's often adapted, which basically is like the first person who shows up is in charge until they delegate it to someone else. Just a thing to think about. The communication part is, what is an outage for your business? What's worth waking up for? What should you be investigating first thing tomorrow morning? Those are very different topics. And oftentimes, you have to decide whether the business is like actually accurate that you should be waking up for a 5-minute outage, or if it's something that you can wait till tomorrow. And a common problem is, do people know where to go when there is an incident? If something's down, is there a place they can check to actually know that this is being actively worked on, and they're not the first person to discover that something's not working. My example here is from Hillary for America. It's a very dramatically growing organization, and in June 2016 we decided to redo all of our alerts. We had been given a bunch of alerts from the Groundwork, which is an organization we were working with, plus we had written a bunch, and we had changed as an organization greatly. In the summer of 2015, we were like 6 people, and by the summer of 2015 to 2016, we were like 60 or 70, maybe 80 engineers. And while the alerts were great, they were waking us up probably 2 or 3 times a week when we didn't need to be, and firing a lot throughout the day for things that weren't actual issues. And we were now the Democratic nominee for the Democratic Party. And so we had much different concerns than we did the previous year. So we started documenting all of our existing alerts. And we wrote down a doc. We had by then 4 SRE ops people inside of HFA, and we wrote down a doc of like, these are the rules of how we're going to evaluate into our 3 buckets, which are wake me up, send a message on Slack, or just make sure we have a graph. And we went through that. We broke up our 100 some odd alerts that we had among the team, and then we came back and discussed each alert and made sure that like the suggested bucket by the person who went through that alert worked. We went from pages being about 30% actionable to about 85% actionable, and I started sleeping a lot better, which I was a huge fan of. We explicitly left some noisy alerts in because that's what our business needed. We had a few occasions where 404s would spike on our site because people would link to URLs that didn't exist, either due to just late night communication, someone missed a step in a checklist, or people that aren't associated with a campaign making up URLs. And so we needed to figure out, like pretty much in all cases, we'd wanted to be woken up for that, and that tended to be a very noisy alert, as an example. But for the most part, we slept a lot better. Pyramid. Next step is postmortems. We've had incidents, and now we need to go over what the incident was and try to make ourselves better. The whole point of postmortems, in my mind, is to document an outage and discuss them. Often something you hear is, will there be a postmortem? And I'm a big proponent of, if someone asks, the answer is yes. To also explain this picture, this is my postmortem of a breakfast sandwich. It was delicious. The communication aspect of postmortem, the only reason a postmortem exists is to communicate. So there's a lot here, but you're writing a document for future reference. You're communicating with people you haven't met yet, you very possibly may never work with, but you're trying to document everything that happened and what went down and how you fixed it, and why you made your decisions. The point is to write a document that communicates with all parties associated with your business. Do you have a customer service team? Can they understand it so they can communicate with external customers? Do you have other engineering teams? Can they understand it so that they can not make similar mistakes? Can your boss understand it so they know what you're doing all day? Those sorts of things. Example comes from when I was working on Google Compute Engine. There were a lot of outages in 2013. 2013 was the year Google was changing Google Compute Engine from being a sort of beta service, which had been launched in June of 2012 to the external world, to December of 2013 when it opened it up to the full public. And so there were just a lot of outages. There were about 6 different product teams and 1 SRE team. And we were running into the issue where escalation chains weren't working. So people would have outages and not tell someone, and then another team would notice the outage because they were dependent on it, and then they would have an outage, and there was no collaboration going on. And then also people would break for similar reasons. Like the storage team would break for one reason, and then the networking team would break for a very similar reason. So we started doing 2 things. For the most part, we brought everyone into a bi-weekly meeting. Forced purely on communication is get everyone into the same room. At the very least, all of the technical leads, site reliability engineers, the product managers, and senior leaderships to know this is what you should be telling the people under you of how we communicate, how we do postmortems, and the types of outages that we're having across our different sub-teams. And then we would also bring in usually the engineers associated with the actual outage, and then share the postmortems widely, because this was also a distributed team. We had engineers mainly in Seattle, but also in San Francisco, Mountain View, and a few in New York and Dublin. Next up is testing and releasing. So we've sort of dealt with the immediate fires, right? The monitoring was to make sure we know what's currently going on or has gone on recently. Incident response is to respond to things that we discover in our monitoring. Postmortems to go over those incidents that have just happened. So now we can start looking forward. And usually the way that engineering teams move forward is by writing code and releasing it. Testing and releasing is my favorite area for automation, because there's a lot you can do to sort of improve developers' lives. Oftentimes people look at how long their build takes or how long their test run takes. And there's many ways, there's a reason there's an entire release engineering field into making this faster. But it's very dependent on your team, I think more so than any of the other categories, because every team writes software so differently, depending on your stack, depending on your environment that you're deploying it to. But the overall key is improve people's lives by catching bugs and other issues before they're available to every single user that uses your product. So conversations that you can start having around testing and releasing. Are tests being written? Do tests actually test how customers use your product? How often does your team want to release? Like, can you release without an outage? Does that matter to your organization? What will happen to the service when you release? These are all sorts of things to start thinking about, is because oftentimes, people just write a slew of unit tests and like, oh, the code's tested. You have to have those discussions with the engineers that you're working with. Two quick stories around this, mainly because I've personally made both of these mistakes. The first engineer I worked with at Hillary for America, named Amy Hales. Amy saved the day basically by automating our Fastly config. Fastly is a CDN service, and they let you push varnish config straight to them. So you can write VCL and send it up, and as long as it compiles, you're good to go. It's live on all of their edge nodes. And we were running into the problem where we had a different different config in both our development environment and our production environment, and also we weren't really testing things. So Amy automated our testing across all of our systems to make sure our varnish compiles and it met a basic set of tests, and then she also automated the deployment so that anything that got deployed to dev also got deployed to prod and vice versa. So we had a consistent config across both environments. And considering that she did this in June or July, and from there, for those of you who follow the U.S. political elections, our presidential election cycle, July is a calm moment with lots of people talking, and then you sort of keep going crazy from there. The next is an engineer named Bill at Google. He was sort of my main code reviewer on a project I work on called Google Cloud Status. And I wrote some very basic unit tests, and my build would just be green. I was like, Bill, let's just auto deploy on green. It'll be great. Every time you review my code, we'll press submit, and then 5 minutes later, it'll be running for everyone, and it'll be amazing. And I wanted this because it would allow me to develop faster, and since this was sort of a side project and not my normal day gig, I wanted to use those 30 minutes here and there that I got to work on it to actually quickly iterate on something. Bill said no, because Bill is a saner person than I am, and Bill pointed out that you don't, based off of the unit tests, I didn't actually know if the code was working, and he actually wrote a unit test for me that basically this whole site was broken, but the tests were all green, as just an example, to prove that I was wrong, which was nice. And it sort of just reminded me that I didn't actually know how people were going to be using this, because right now my internal customers were basically me. And so we started walking through and actually doing user tests, and starting writing up integration tests. And so then we had integration tests that turned green so that we could automate deployment to get it out there, which was nice, because we had also meant to do user tests at some point, so it forced our hand. So thanks, Bill Thiede. All right, so testing, releasing. We sort of know what the impact of our changes is because we're monitoring our system, and we know when we're testing, or we know when we're releasing things. So the next sort of thing is to figure out how we're going to grow over time. It's often called capacity planning. Graph of growth of cost over time, but the idea of capacity planning is a plan for infrastructure growth. It's easy to ignore now that a large number of web companies run on other people's computers, but it's still something you have to think about. You can help your business out a lot by figuring out the costs of how your infrastructure is going to grow. If you know, the next year, give or take, where it's going to cost us $20,000, that's a lot different than $5,000 or $1 million or whatever your scale is. It also helps your engineers think about how they're going to engineer things and design, an architect. If you're saying we need to stick to only growing our cluster by 10 machines, their infrastructure decisions will hopefully be different than yeah, you can add whatever you want. And it's just something to think about. the communication is basically, the first step is figuring out how much money you have. In some cases, you don't have a real budget. I've worked at places, like Google, where there's someone out there managing a budget, but your capacity planning, for the most part, is not there yet. Google offers, for example, for a long time, we weren't thinking about that. It was like, oh, we're just going to push this feature, and it doesn't really matter how it affects things. But working at a small business, when we were an engineering team of 6 at Punched, $50 was dinner for the whole team, and that's so that was a lot of money because we were 20 something. And how much does the business expect to grow over the next time period? And does that match with your plans? If the business is expecting for you to double your number of users over the next 6 months, do you have the money to actually scale to meet that? And are you making the engineering decisions to meet that? You need to have those conversations early, but only early enough that you actually have the data to support what you're going to do. Example of this from Hillary for America is a piece of software called Pogostick. Pogostick was built by Alex Burke. She built a tool that was a URL shortener for tracking email metrics. Basically, when people sent emails, political campaigns send a lot of emails, at least in the US. So it would get large spikes of traffic because people would get this email that's like, Hillary Clinton wants you to donate as much money as you possibly can to us so that we can keep the lights on and she can win. And so that would cause a lot of spikes of traffic as people click these links. And so we would monitor for these spikes. And these spikes would grow over time as people signed up for our email lists. So as the list grew, the email team would reach out to Alex and basically be like, hey, this week we're planning X number of sends, which is an increase from last week, and our email list has tripled in size or something like that, completely arbitrary metrics. And she would then decide how much of that growth, are we prepared for that growth? And she had access to all of the metrics, and she had built a dashboard that met her needs, explained how the system was working. And sometimes you'd be like, well, our last send, which was half of this, used 50% of our CPU or something like that. So if we double it, and last time we doubled, we saw a similar CPU jump, we should increase the number of cores we have or something like that. She would then reach out to the ops team saying hey, I'm going to need more machines. And so we'd be able to have this sort of conversational loop. But she also, since it was basically based on user sign-up, she didn't be able to build as much of a plan as sort of be able to react relatively quickly to say hey, we need to grow this amount because over the past day we've had to react in this way. And so she had the tools to basically initiate the conversation. So I didn't have to do anything until Alex sent me a PR or said I'm going to do this. Is that okay? And be yeah, fine. Spin up four more M4 XLs or whatever she needed to do, which was really great. Both removing, lowering the amount of energy we had to focus on each individual application, but also letting her plan for capacity over time based off of conversations she was having with the email team. So the next is, I guess, my favorite topic, which is development. I love the phrase "automate yourself out of a job." I think I don't know, that's why I got really attracted to SRE. Is I can work on tools so that I don't have to do the same thing in 6 months. So my memory is horrible, and I'll just often forget how things work. And so if I've automated it, I really don't have to worry about it. And I have said that quote before and also quit because of that. So I feel like I'm at least sticking to my mantra for whatever that's worth. This is another communication thing is how I think most software engineers, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong after the talk, but most of us want to build the cool thing, and that has a cost to it, both your time and your energy. There are a lot of things. In most organizations I've worked at, there's been one SRE to every 10 to 12 developers, and that's a lot of incoming problems and things to think about of just like those 10 to 12 people. Is it worth like me basically ignoring those people for a month to build the next cool tool that I think will make everyone's lives better versus what's out there? Can I use Terraform instead of writing my own change config? Can I use a hosted monitoring system instead of like inventing my own time series database or whatever? Or is there like a script that does this thing instead of spending the 30 minutes to write it? These are conversations you have to have with yourself and your team, knowing their priorities. I go to the sprint planning meeting in my current job of all of our engineers. I go to both of them, and like I basically lose my Wednesday to it because there's lots of planning and people talking about all of the work that they're doing. But it lets me know like these are the priorities of the teams that I'm supporting and what they're doing, and whether or not I can like take the time to go work on the tools that I want to work on, or if I need to focus on making sure that they can be successful at their jobs. And then I think the other aspect of this is how are other companies solving these problems? SRE isn't done in a vacuum, as I've sort of been mentioning over and over. Is you need to have conversations, but not necessarily always within your company. Networking. I have a coffee with someone who works at another startup just down the street, and we talk about all sorts of like engineering problems. He's been harping on me for weeks for not checking out this new monitoring system that he thinks is going to solve all my problems. But it's a good way to share, what other people are doing and how they're solving their problems. This conference and many others are great to actually figure out, like, how can we solve these problems in ways that either save us time or energy or money. And then this is my personal problem, is I often think that things are much larger problems than most other people. I think we all have our like little pet peeves on things that you want to fix right now, and really they can sit for 6 months often, or at least a day. I highly recommend stepping back before diving into your next like coding project and being like, do we actually need to solve this right now? I've definitely lost a few days and been like, that was a waste of time. But yeah. Examples. These are also from Hillary for America, just 2 tools that I personally built. They were built like in August and September, because that was when I felt that we had the other layers sort of taken care of. First was Edge Party. Once all of our deployment to Fastly was automated, we were running into the problem that like a lot of people wanted to add redirects across applications in a sort of weird way. So we moved all of that to basically a Slack bot and an API that people could use, so that anyone could write redirects in Slack, assuming they were like part of a whitelisted group of users. And then Pokemon, we wanted to test every single URL because we thought it was a good idea. And Pingdom got expensive, so we turned off our Pingdom account and basically like just never stopped DOSing us for ourselves for the next 3 months. But it provided response metrics for both time and I guess like validity of all of our URLs, which was really helpful for us measuring growth over time. And yeah, they were both built at the last quarter of the campaign. We can now talk about, I guess, an area which I feel like SRE teams at much larger companies realize, and it seems to be lost on sort of operations and SRE groups at smaller organizations, which is user experience. When you like often talk, I think Google personally like talks a lot about how SRE is a customer service role, and that's because I think their organization has gotten to the point where they've solved all of their other problems, I guess. But the point is, for all of this, is to make sure your users have a good experience with your system, both in terms of like, can they load the page, et cetera. And we, as people who tend to focus on the infrastructure, we have a lot of effect on that. Because, you know, sure, there's the feature aspect, but how those features are delivered to our users can be like a make or break situation. If your page takes, you know, 5 seconds to load before you can click on anything, it's a much different experience than, you know, the instantaneous sort of flash of, you know, Twitter or Google or something like that. And this is sort of the conversation you need to have. And there's hopefully someone who knows the answer to these questions in your business. But I've also been in positions where no one's been able to have just like figure that out yet because, you know, you had just started monitoring or something like that. So how are your users experience your product? You know, are they coming in mobile? Are they, you know, doing it at, you know, all at once? Is it like they stay on the page for 20 minutes, or, you know, do they only come when you send them an email and they click a link? Where users experience your product. You know, are all of your customers in New Zealand? Like, you have much different networking latency in New Zealand to like Virginia versus like New York to Virginia. And when are your users experience your product? My like classic example of this now is, once again, Hillary for America, because most of our users were in the US and like you could follow the US like diurnal cycle. Google Compute Engine is running VMs for people all over the world and like does not have that like night off time. A way that I've approached this, I slightly mentioned this product or thing earlier in the talk, which is status.cloud.google.com. Before the product had launched, before Compute Engine had launched, this was something I think the SRE team was starting to think about, but no one else had really gotten around to it because I was mentioning in 2013, like people were still kind of fractured and working as independent subteams. And I sort of went out like, who's going to build status.cloud.google.com? And first of all, like at the time, the technical infrastructure organization side of Google didn't have any designers or like anyone thinking about that. So there was no like person that could even like start mocking this out. And then also most of the other subteams were like working to make sure that they had all of the features that they needed to launch in like June. I, as like a relatively new SRE, like had some bandwidth. So we started basically building up the thing, and the whole, like building the actual website took, you know, in reality like 2 months of time, but the next 2 years were spent talking to engineers, product teams, customer service teams, you know, deciding like who would actually update this thing, how often does it get updated. I'm personally very proud of that because now I think Google's Postmortems and status updates are some of the best in the industry. But that takes a lot of time to make sure that like people know this thing exists and that they can talk together. And that improves the user experience because as someone who's like using one of the cloud services, now you can go and like, my website's down, is it Google's fault? And if the answer is yes, hopefully there's like a little yellow or red dot on the screen. It's not a guarantee, but if it's constantly responding at the way that you expect them to be telling the truth, then you can at least start focusing on your own service and, you know, not blame other people and actually have like a reasonable answer to why something's not working. So that was a pyramid. Once again, I hope that it came across that communication is really important in all of these, and that you can apply it to many different levels of companies, whether you're like 6 people or 70,000. Please talk to people. These slides will be put up somewhere, but there's lots of references in future reading. There's lots of stuff. I'll be here, standing over here for questions. If you don't feel comfortable talking in person, you can DM me, Iko on Twitter, or that's my email address. Thank you so much.